Money buys a lot of things. It buys sprawling penthouses overlooking Central Park, ironclad silence from the press, and the shimmering illusion of a flawless marriage. But Tristan Montgomery forgot the one thing his new millions couldn't buy: immunity from his billionaire father-in-law. When Tristan decided to risk his vows and his 6 months pregnant wife's heart for a clandestine affair with his PR director, he thought he was playing the sophisticated game of a powerful man. He didn't realize he wasn't a player at all. He was just a pawn on Richard Hayes's board. And in the Hayes family, betrayal isn't met with tears or couples therapy. It is met with absolute, calculated annihilation. The ballroom at the Pierre Hotel was suffocatingly fragrant, choked with 10,000 white hydrangeas imported from Holland. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan, but for the elite circle orbiting the Hayes family, the rest of the world and its standard working hours had ceased to exist. This was the baby shower for Carolyn Hayes Montgomery, the only daughter of real estate and private equity titan Richard Hayes. Caroline, at 28, was a vision of maternal elegance. She wore a bespoke silk crepe gown that gracefully draped over her 6-month baby bump, a diamond tennis bracelet glittering on her wrist, a push present given 3 months early by her husband, Tristan. Tristan was the golden boy of Silicon Alley. At 32, he was the charismatic CEO of Ethel Tech, a cybersecurity firm that had recently gone public, netting him a personal fortune of roughly $150 million. To the outside world, they were the ultimate power couple, the beautiful, philanthropic heiress and the self-made tech millionaire. But $150 million is a drop in the ocean compared to the $8 billion commanded by Richard Hayes, and that invisible, suffocating weight of his father-in-law's wealth was a chip that rested squarely on Tristan's tailored Italian shoulder. Standing near the ice sculpture, Tristan held a glass of sparkling cider, playing the role of the doting, expectant father to perfection. He rested a protective hand on the small of Caroline's back, flashing his signature, camera-ready smile at the society photographers hired for the event. "You're glowing, darling," Tristan murmured, kissing her temple. "Arthur is going to have the most beautiful mother in New York." Caroline beamed, leaning into his touch. "And the most successful father. I'm so proud of you, Tris. With the new merger closing next week, Arthur's future is completely secured." "Everything I do is for this family," Tristan said, his voice dropping an octave in that sincere, convincing way that had charmed venture capitalists and board members alike. Across the room, seated at a table reserved for Ethel Tech executives, sat Chloe Hastings. Chloe was 30, fiercely ambitious, and the vice president of public relations at Tristan's company. She was stunning in a sharp, minimalist emerald slip dress that felt entirely out of place amidst the pastel tulle and floral arrangements of a baby shower. Chloe caught Tristan's eye over the rim of her champagne flute. She didn't look away. Instead, a slow, knowing smirk played on her lips before she took a deliberate sip. Tristan shifted his gaze quickly, but the invisible tether between them was electric. For 8 months, long before Carolyn had even announced her pregnancy, Tristan and Chloe had been playing a dangerous, intoxicating game. What started as late-night strategy meetings over scotch at the St. Regis had evolved into stolen weekends in Aspen under the guise of investor summits. To Tristan, Chloe represented everything his marriage didn't: rebellion, raw ambition, and a complete absence of the Hayes family legacy. With Chloe, he wasn't Richard Hayes's son-in-law. He was a god. However, Tristan had underestimated the silent observer standing by the arched windows. Richard Hayes did not acquire a global empire by missing the details. a man of 65 with a mane of silver hair and eyes as cold and calculating as a winter ocean. Richard watched the exchange. He saw the subtle tension in Tristan's jaw. He saw the brazen, almost territorial look in the PR executive's eyes. Richard took a slow sip of his bourbon. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply pulled his phone from his tuxedo jacket and fired off a single, cryptic text to his head of private security, a former MI6 operative named Jonathan. Run a full, discreet diagnostic on Montgomery. Digital, financial, physical. I want his shadow mapped. The shower concluded with a speech from Tristan that left half the room in tears, praising Carolyn's strength and his awe at becoming a father. He held her hand so tightly it almost hurt, the picture of devotion. But as they climbed into the back of their chauffeured Maybach to return to their Tribeca penthouse, Tristan pulled out his phone. "Sorry, babe," he sighed, massaging his temples. "Server crisis. I need to head back to the office for a few hours. I hate to leave you after such a long day." Caroline, exhausted and aching, smiled softly. "It's okay, Tristan. Go save the world. Arthur and I are just going to take a long bath and sleep." Tristan kissed her forehead, the smell of his expensive Tom Ford cologne lingering in the air. "I love you. I'll be home before midnight." As the Maybach pulled away, leaving Tristan on the corner of Fifth Avenue, he didn't head downtown toward the Ethel Tech headquarters. Instead, he walked 2 blocks east, slipping into the back of a waiting black town car. Chloe was already inside. "How was the endless parade of pastel?" she purred, wrapping her arms around his neck the second the doors locked. "Suffocating," Tristan breathed, crashing his lips onto hers. "Take us to Chelsea." 3 weeks later, the illusion shattered. It was a rainy Thursday morning. Tristan had flown to London for a critical board meeting regarding Ethel Tech's European expansion. Carolyn was nesting. At 7 months pregnant, her maternal instincts had kicked into overdrive, and she had spent the morning organizing the penthouse's library. She was looking for the property tax documents for their Hamptons house to send to their accountant. Tristan usually handled the paperwork, but he was notoriously disorganized, leaving stacks of mail in his rosewood desk. As Carolyn sifted through a pile of bank statements, she knocked over a heavy leather humidor. It didn't spill cigars, it spilled a sleek, black metal hard drive. Frowning, Carolyn picked it up. Tristan used cloud storage for everything. A physical hard drive was an archaic anomaly for a tech CEO. Curiosity, completely innocent at first, urged her to plug it into her MacBook. She expected to find old source code or boring legal contracts. Instead, a folder popped up. It was simply titled Blue Horizon. She clicked it open. The first document was a lease agreement for a luxury townhouse in Chelsea. The rent was an astronomical $30,000 a month, paid in full for 2 years by an LLC. The secondary guarantor on the lease was Chloe Hastings. Caroline's breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across her neck. She told herself there was a logical explanation. A corporate lease? A perk for a high-performing executive? But her hands were shaking as she clicked on the next file. It was a folder of digital receipts, a charge from Graf Diamonds for $140,000. Item: emerald-cut tennis necklace. It was dated the day before her baby shower. Tristan hadn't given her a necklace. He had given her a bracelet. Then, the final file. A hidden, encrypted backup of a messaging app. Tristan was a cybersecurity expert, but his arrogance had made him sloppy. He had backed up the logs onto a physical drive just in case his phone was ever wiped remotely by corporate. Caroline clicked the file. It required a password. With a trembling hand, she typed Tristan's usual password. Incorrect. She tried her name. Incorrect. She stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision, and typed, "Chloe." The folder unlocked. Hundreds of messages flooded the screen. "Tristan, the shower was torture. All I could think about was your dress. I'll be at the townhouse in 20. Chloe, make sure you play the good husband. We need her dad's capital for the merger. Once the ink is dry, we can figure out the exit strategy. Tristan, I'm securing the assets. By the time Arthur is born, I'll have enough leverage to keep my company completely separate from the Hayes empire. Then, it's just you and me." Caroline stared at the glowing screen. The words blurred into a vicious, suffocating static. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was plotting against her family. He was using her pregnancy, using her father's influence, to inflate his own wealth before planning to discard her. The man who had kissed her stomach every night and whispered to their unborn son was a phantom. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through her stomach. She gasped, grabbing the edge of the desk, terrified the shock was inducing early labor. She forced herself to breathe, inhale, exhale, for Arthur. The tears stopped. The sorrow, heavy and suffocating, suddenly calcified into something else. Something she had inherited from her father. Pure, unadulterated ice. She didn't call Tristan. She didn't scream, and she didn't throw his clothes out the window. She calmly unplugged the hard drive, slipped it into her Hermes Birkin bag, and walked to the elevator. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery." The doorman greeted her downstairs. "Good morning, Thomas. Please have my driver bring the car around. I'm going to Connecticut." 2 hours later, the gates of the Hayes estate in Greenwich parted. It was a sprawling, stone manor, situated on 40 acres of private woodland. Richard Hayes was in his study, a cavernous room lined with first-edition books, smoking a cigar and reviewing quarterly reports. When Caroline walked in, Richard looked up. One glance at his daughter's pale face, and the hard, unfamiliar set of her jaw told him everything he needed to know. "Close the door, sweet pea," Richard said quietly, setting his cigar down. Caroline walked to his desk. She didn't cry. She reached into her bag, pulled out the black hard drive, and set it on the polished mahogany. "He's cheating on me," Caroline said, her voice eerily steady. "With his VP of PR, Chloe Hastings. And worse, he's planning an exit strategy to secure his assets and leverage your capital for his merger before he leaves me." Richard did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of surprise. He simply placed his large, weathered hand over the hard drive. "I know," Richard said softly. Caroline blinked, momentarily thrown. "You knew?" "I've had a full surveillance team on him since the baby shower," Richard explained, his voice devoid of emotion, operating on pure, tactical logic. "Jonathan discovered the Chelsea townhouse a week ago. I was waiting to build an impenetrable legal wall before I brought it to you. I did not want to stress you or my grandson until I had his head on a platter." Caroline sank into a leather armchair, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He thinks he's so smart, Dad. He thinks he's outplaying us." Richard stood up. He walked over to a crystal decanter and poured a small glass of water, handing it to his daughter. "Tristan is a boy playing with matches in a dynamite factory," Richard said, walking behind his desk. He picked up his phone. "He believes his little cybersecurity firm makes him untouchable. He forgets who built the infrastructure he walks on." "What do we do?" Caroline asked, resting her hand on her pregnant belly. "I want him gone, Dad. But I don't want a messy public divorce. I won't have Arthur growing up with his mother dragged through the tabloids." "There will be no tabloids," Richard replied smoothly, "because there will be nothing left of Tristan Montgomery for the press to write about. He flies back from London on Sunday, correct?" "Yes, straight to the office to finalize his big merger with the Vanguard Group. Richard smiled. It was a terrifying expression. By the time his plane touches down at JFK, he will own nothing. He will control nothing. We are going to strip him to the bone. Richard pressed a button on his intercom. "Jonathan, get my legal team on the line, the senior partners. Call Marcus from Vanguard and tell him to halt the Ethel Tech merger negotiations immediately. And contact the board of directors at Ethel. It's time for a hostile takeover." Caroline watched her father work, feeling a dark sense of vindication wash over her. Tristan had thought her a naive, trusting wife. He had forgotten that before she was a Montgomery, she was a Hayes. "Dad," Caroline interrupted softly. Richard paused, looking at her with fierce, protective love. "Yes, darling?" "Make sure Chloe Hastings is in the room when it happens." Richard Hayes did not become a billionaire by acting on impulse. He was a master of the long game, a predator who preferred to bleed his prey dry before the final, fatal strike. The weekend following Caroline's discovery was a masterclass in corporate warfare, orchestrated entirely from the soundproofed study of the Greenwich estate. By Friday morning, the legal strike team from Cravath, Swain and Moore had assembled in Richard's home. There were 6 senior partners, men and women whose hourly rates equated to the annual salaries of most working Americans. They sat around the mahogany conference table, iPads glowing, dissecting the financial anatomy of Ethel Tech. Tristan's entire leverage for the Vanguard Group merger hinges on the Series C funding round he closed last year, explained William Sterling, Richard's lead corporate attorney. William was a sharp, ruthless man who had brokered billions in hostile takeovers. He used his shares in Ethel as collateral for a massive personal line of credit through Goldman Sachs to fund his lavish lifestyle and that secret Chelsea townhouse. But here is the fatal flaw, Richard. Hayes International is the secondary guarantor on that line of credit. We underwrote his arrogance. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. And the covenants of that guarantee? Standard Hayes protocol, William smirked, tapping his stylus against the screen. A strict morality and public image clause, originally drafted to protect your brand when he married Caroline. Any action deemed to cause reputational harm to the Hayes family or its subsidiaries allows the guarantor to instantly call the debt. In full. "How much does he owe?" Caroline asked. She sat at the opposite end of the table, dressed in a soft cashmere sweater, her hands resting protectively over her baby bump. Her tears had dried days ago, replaced by a chilling, resolute calm. $42 million, William replied, due within 24 hours of the clause being invoked. "Invoke it," Richard ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Contact Goldman Sachs. Tell them I am pulling my guarantee due to a breach of the morality clause. The debt is to be called immediately. When Tristan inevitably defaults, I want to purchase that debt. I want to own every single share he put up as collateral." "That will trigger a change of control at Ethel Tech," William noted, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. "The board of directors will have to freeze him out. He won't just lose his money, he'll lose his company." "That," Richard said coldly, "is the objective." While the financial guillotine was being raised in New York, Tristan Montgomery was entirely oblivious, living a fantasy of his own design 4,000 miles away. In London, Tristan and Chloe were occupying the royal suite at the Savoy, a sprawling expanse of Edwardian luxury overlooking the River Thames. The Vanguard merger meetings had wrapped up on Friday afternoon with a handshake that Tristan believed had cemented his legacy. He had spent the weekend celebrating his impending godhood. "To us," Tristan toasted, clinking his crystal flute of Dom Perignon against Chloe's. They were lounging in plush monogrammed robes on the suite's private balcony. To Ethel Tech going global, Chloe corrected with a wicked smile, taking a sip. And to freedom? When exactly are you going to drop the bomb on the Ice Princess? Tristan chuckled, wrapping an arm around Chloe's waist and pulling her close. The Vanguard deal goes public on Tuesday. The payout will hit my offshore accounts by Wednesday. Once the capital is secured and untraceable by Richard's auditors, I'll file the papers. I've already had my lawyers draft a settlement that offers Carolyn a generous lump sum, provided she signs a non-disclosure agreement regarding the divorce. Richard hates bad press. He'll force her to take it to keep things quiet. Chloe traced the line of Tristan's jaw. You're brilliant, you know that. Outsmarting Richard Hayes. Not many men can say they've done that. Richard is a dinosaur. Tristan scoffed, his arrogance blinding him to the reality of the food chain. He deals in concrete and steel. I deal in the future. By this time next week, we'll be untouchable. He kissed her, tasting the expensive champagne and the intoxicating thrill of his own perceived genius. He had no idea that at that exact moment, across the Atlantic, his keycards to the Ethel Tech building had been deactivated, his corporate accounts frozen, and his prized position as CEO formally terminated by an emergency board vote. The future he was boasting about had already been erased. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy, bruised sky over the tri-state area. Tristan's Gulfstream G650, leased under the company's expense account, began its descent into Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Teterboro was the preferred entry point for the Manhattan elite, quiet, private, and free from the chaotic gaze of the public terminals at JFK. Chloe had flown back on a commercial first-class flight a day earlier to avoid arousing any suspicion with Caroline, maintaining the illusion of their separate professional lives. Tristan sat alone in the plush leather cabin, swirling a glass of scotch, drafting an email on his tablet to the Vanguard executives to finalize Tuesday's press release. As the jet touched down and taxied toward the private hangar, Tristan checked his phone. It was strange. He hadn't received a single text or email from Caroline all weekend. Usually, she would send him updates about the baby or ask when his flight was landing. He dismissed the thought. She was probably just moody from the pregnancy. The jet stairs unfolded, and Tristan stepped out into the damp, cool evening air, pulling his tailored trench coat tight. He looked toward the tarmac, expecting to see his usual driver, a cheerful man named Hector, standing by the black Maybach. Instead, a slate-gray armored Cadillac Escalade was idling by the hangar. Standing beside it was Jonathan, Richard Hayes's imposing head of private security. Jonathan was built like a cinder block, with cold, dead eyes and a tailored suit that barely concealed the firearm holstered beneath his jacket. Tristan frowned, a flicker of unease finally piercing his armor of arrogance. "Jonathan, what are you doing here? Where's Hector?" "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery," Jonathan said, his voice a flat, emotionless gravel. He opened the rear door of the Escalade. "Mr. Hayes requested I pick you up personally. There has been a change of plans." "A change of plans?" Tristan balked, stepping back. "Is it Caroline? Is the baby okay?" "Caroline and the baby are in perfect health," Jonathan replied, gesturing sharply toward the open door. "Please get in, sir. We are expected in Manhattan." Tristan hesitated. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what the hell is going on. I need to go to my penthouse." Jonathan stepped forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was unmistakable. "You no longer reside at the penthouse, Mr. Montgomery. Your belongings have been moved. Now, you can get in the vehicle under your own power, or I can put you in the vehicle. The choice is yours." Tristan swallowed hard, the scotch suddenly turning sour in his stomach. He climbed into the back of the Escalade, his mind racing. Had Richard found out about the offshore accounts? Did Vanguard leak the terms of the merger early? The thought of Chloe never even crossed his mind. They had been too careful. He used encrypted drives, burner phones, secret ledgers. He was a cybersecurity genius. He was secure. The drive into Manhattan was a suffocating, silent nightmare. Jonathan didn't speak. The privacy partition remained firmly rolled up. When the Escalade finally pulled up to the curb, Tristan realized they weren't at the Hayes corporate headquarters, nor were they at the family estate. They were parked outside the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Ethel Tech. "Why are we at my office?" Tristan demanded, as Jonathan opened the door for him. "The 52nd floor, Mr. Montgomery. The boardroom," Jonathan instructed, ignoring the question entirely. He escorted Tristan through the lobby. Tristan noticed immediately that the night security guards, men he paid, did not look him in the eye. They stared at the floor as he walked past. When he reached the elevator, he swiped his biometric thumbprint over the scanner. A red light flashed. Access denied. Jonathan smoothly stepped forward and swiped a black, unmarked keycard. The light turned green, and the doors slid open. Panic, cold and sharp, finally took root in Tristan's chest. The 52nd floor was completely silent. The lights in the executive suites were dimmed. Tristan walked down the glass corridor toward the main boardroom. The heavy oak doors were closed. He pushed them open. The massive room was illuminated only by the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sitting at the very head of the long glass table, silhouetted against the glittering skyline of the city he practically owned, was Richard Hayes. To Richard's right sat William Sterling, the corporate attorney, surrounded by neat stacks of legal dossiers. To Richard's left sat Chloe Hastings. Chloe looked like she had seen a ghost. Her usual pristine composure was shattered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and she was gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly her knuckles were white. She wouldn't look at Tristan. "What is this?" Tristan demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped into the room. He forced a mask of indignation over his rising terror. "Richard, what the hell is going on? Why is my security access revoked? Why is Chloe here?" Richard Hayes slowly closed the file folder in front of him. He looked up at Tristan, his eyes devoid of any warmth, any familial connection. He looked at Tristan the way one looks at a cockroach before stepping on it. "Sit down, Tristan," Richard said. The command was quiet, but it echoed off the glass walls with the force of a thunderclap. Tristan didn't move. "I asked you a question. I am the CEO of this company, and I demand to know—" "You are nothing," Richard interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating baritone. "You are the former CEO of this company. You are a man deeply in debt. And as of an hour ago, you are entirely destitute. Sit down." Tristan's legs gave out. He collapsed into the nearest ergonomic chair. He looked wildly at Chloe. "Chloe, what did you do? Did you say something?" Chloe finally met his eyes, tears welling up. "They know, Tristan. They know everything. The Chelsea townhouse, the encrypted files, the offshore accounts. They brought me in here 4 hours ago. They threatened to ruin me. They have everything." Tristan felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. The drive is in my private humidor at the penthouse. It's encrypted. It is currently sitting on my daughter's nightstand in Greenwich," Richard said smoothly. "You arrogant fool. You truly believed you could use my family's capital, sleep in a bed I paid for, court a woman on my dime, and scheme to leave my pregnant daughter without consequence? Richard, please, let me explain, Tristan stammered, his polished, camera-ready persona dissolving into pathetic desperation. The messages. It was just talk. It was a stupid mistake. I love Caroline. I love Arthur. Do not say my grandson's name, Richard warned, leaning forward, the predatory intensity radiating from him. You lost the right to speak his name the moment you signed the lease on that Chelsea apartment. William Sterling cleared his throat, opening a dossier. Mr. Montgomery, as of 9 a.m. on Friday, Goldman Sachs invoked the morality and reputational harm clause on your $42 million line of credit. When you failed to produce the capital by 9 a.m. on Saturday, you defaulted. The Hayes International Holding Group, as the secondary guarantor, assumed the debt. We also assumed all collateral tied to that debt, namely, your 70% controlling stake in Ethel Tech. Tristan felt like he was suffocating. The room spun. No, Vanguard. The Vanguard merger covers that debt. It closes on Tuesday. Vanguard pulled out, William stated coldly. Mr. Hayes had a brief conversation with their CEO this morning. Once they learned of your impending insolvency and the moral turpitude involved, they walked away. Ethel Tech is currently hemorrhaging value. The board held an emergency meeting this afternoon. You were terminated for gross misconduct. Tristan stared at the table, his mind short-circuiting. The millions, the jets, the legacy, it was all evaporating into thin air. You can't do this. I built this company. I wrote the original source code. And I bought the infrastructure, Richard countered. You are trespassing in my building, Tristan. Tristan turned his desperate gaze back to Chloe. Chloe, we can fight this. We know the PR angles. We can spin this. We can take the algorithm and start over. Just you and me. Chloe let out a wet, bitter laugh, wiping a tear from her cheek. Are you insane, Tristan? Fight Richard Hayes? I'm not going down with your sinking ship. She stood up, pulling a signed document from her purse and sliding it across the table toward Richard. I signed the non-disclosure agreement, Mr. Hayes, Chloe said, her voice shaking but resolute. I resign from Ethel Tech, effective immediately. I will never speak of this company, your family, or Tristan Montgomery again. Richard didn't even look at her. Jonathan will escort you to the service elevator, Ms. Hastings. Do not ever return to this city. Tristan watched in horror as Chloe turned her back on him. She didn't look back as Jonathan led her out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind them. The woman he had risked his entire empire for had traded him for her own survival in less than 5 minutes. Tristan was alone, stripped of his title, his wealth, his lover, and his family. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked slowly around the table until he was standing directly behind Tristan. Tomorrow morning, Caroline's lawyers will serve you with divorce papers, Richard said quietly, his voice hovering just over Tristan's shoulder. You will sign them, uncontested. You will walk away with the clothes on your back and the crushing weight of a $42 million debt that you now owe directly to me. If you attempt to contact Caroline, if you attempt to see my grandson, or if you ever breathe a word of this to the press, I will not just ruin you financially. I will erase you from the face of the earth. Do you understand me, Tristan? Tristan could only nod, tears of sheer terror and absolute defeat spilling onto his tailored lapels. The golden illusion was dead. The real world, Richard Hayes' world, had finally arrived. The morning after the boardroom massacre, Tristan Montgomery woke up to the sound of a rattling air conditioning unit. He was not in the silk-sheeted king bed of his Tribeca penthouse, nor was he in the plush royal suite at the Savoy. He was in a faded, heavily perfumed room at a mid-tier chain hotel near LaGuardia Airport, paid for with the last $300 of usable cash he had in his money clip. He stared at the popcorn ceiling, a crushing weight sitting on his chest. His smartphone, a top-of-the-line model he usually used to command a global tech firm, was now nothing more than a useless brick. Ethel Tech had remotely wiped it during the night, executing a ruthless corporate wipe that deleted his contacts, emails, passwords, and access to all digital wallets. He was a ghost in the machine he had built. Desperation clawed at his throat. He grabbed the hotel room's landline and dialed the number of his personal wealth manager at Morgan Stanley, a man who had kissed his feet just a week prior. "Frank, it's Tristan. I need you to liquidate the emergency index funds and wire the balance to a new account," Tristan demanded, trying to inject his old, authoritative bark into his voice. There was a heavy pause on the other end. "Mr. Montgomery, I was informed by the Hayes Holding Group's legal team at 6 a.m. that all of your assets, including the index funds, were leveraged against your Goldman Sachs line of credit. When you defaulted, those assets were seized to cover the penalty margins. Your accounts with us are frozen, pending a full forensic audit. I'm sorry, but I have been advised by our legal department to terminate this call." The line went dead. Tristan threw the phone against the wall, shattering the cheap plastic. He was trapped in a financial vacuum. Richard Hayes hadn't just fired him. He had surgically removed Tristan's ability to survive in the ecosystem of the elite. By noon, the final blow landed. Tristan was sitting in a rundown diner across from the hotel, staring at a cup of black coffee he couldn't afford to refill, when the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't a waitress. It was Jonathan. The towering security chief looked entirely out of place among the vinyl booths and sticky linoleum floors, dressed in his immaculate charcoal suit. He walked straight to Tristan's table and dropped a thick manila envelope onto the formica surface. "From Mrs. Montgomery's legal counsel," Jonathan said, his voice as sterile as a scalpel. "Divorce proceedings, full termination of marital assets, sole legal and physical custody of the unborn child granted to the mother. You are waiving all parental rights." Tristan stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. "I won't sign it. He's my son. They can't just erase me from my own child's life." "You already erased yourself," Jonathan replied flatly. "Read page 4. If you contest the divorce, Mr. Hayes will immediately file a civil suit for the $42 million you owe him. He will garnish any future wages you ever earn, seize any property you ever attempt to own, and ensure you are embroiled in litigation until the day you die. Or you sign the papers, walk away quietly, and Mr. Hayes will write off the debt as a total loss. He is buying your permanent absence." Tristan opened the envelope with trembling hands. The terms were draconian, airtight, and utterly merciless. He wasn't just losing Carolyn and his fortune, he was being bought out of fatherhood. But as he looked up at Jonathan's cold, unblinking stare, Tristan realized he had no ammunition left. He borrowed a pen from the terrified waitress and signed his name on the dotted lines, effectively signing away his entire existence. 2 months later, the sterile, calculated world of the Hayes Empire was warmed by a single, profound event. In the ultra-exclusive maternity wing of New York Presbyterian Hospital, surrounded by bouquets of white orchids and the quiet hum of fetal monitors, Caroline Hayes gave birth to a healthy, screaming baby boy. She named him Arthur Richard Hayes. Montgomery was officially scrubbed from the birth certificate. Richard stood by the window of the recovery suite, holding the swaddled infant against his chest. For the first time in decades, the ruthless billionaire looked entirely soft. He traced a finger over his grandson's tiny cheek, a rare, genuine smile gracing his face. "He has your eyes, Dad," Caroline said, her voice exhausted, but deeply peaceful. She looked radiant, unburdened by the ghost of her failed marriage. The pain of Tristan's betrayal had been entirely eclipsed by the fierce, protective love she felt for her son. "He has the Hayes resilience," Richard corrected gently, kissing the baby's forehead before handing him back to Caroline. "He is going to inherit the world, sweet pea, and no one will ever be allowed to compromise his future." Caroline held Arthur close, inhaling the sweet, powdery scent of his skin. "What about Tristan? Has he tried to make contact?" Richard's expression instantly hardened, the brief window of softness slamming shut. "He knows better. He is currently living in a rented studio apartment in Hoboken. He attempted to secure a position at 3 different cybersecurity firms in the Valley. A single phone call from my office to their board of directors ensured his resume was shredded. He is effectively blacklisted from the tech industry." "Good," Caroline whispered, her eyes fixed on her son. She wasn't the naive, trusting girl who had walked down the aisle at the Plaza Hotel 2 years ago. The betrayal had forged her into something stronger, something made of the same iron as her father. Leave him there. Let him watch from the gutter as we build Arthur's empire. But Tristan Montgomery was not a man who knew how to surrender gracefully. Stripped of his pride, his money, and his family, a dangerous, toxic resentment began to fester in his cramped Hoboken apartment. He spent his days pacing the peeling hardwood floors, drinking cheap whiskey, and nursing a singular obsessive thought: revenge. Richard Hayes thought he had confiscated every weapon Tristan possessed. But Richard was a real estate mogul, a man of brick, mortar, and finance. He didn't truly understand code, and he certainly didn't know about the Phantom Code. It was a rainy Tuesday in November. Tristan sat in the back corner of a public library in Jersey City, wearing a pulled-down baseball cap and a threadbare jacket. He was typing furiously on a bulky, second-hand laptop he had bought for cash at a pawn shop. He couldn't use his own Wi-Fi. He assumed Jonathan was still monitoring his ISP, so he piggybacked off the library's unsecured public network, routing his connection through a labyrinth of proxy servers in Eastern Europe. When Tristan first built the core algorithm for EthelTech, the revolutionary cybersecurity shield that protected the data of Fortune 500 companies and government contractors, he had been paranoid. He knew that investors would eventually try to push him out. So, long before the IPO, he had buried a backdoor deep within the millions of lines of source code. He called it the Phantom Code. It was a hidden executable command that, when activated from an external terminal, would instantly bypass EthelTech's encryption protocols. It was a master key to the digital vaults of every single client Ethel protected. It was highly illegal, an act of corporate terrorism. But Tristan no longer cared about the law. He only cared about leverage. For weeks, he had been browsing the dark web forums, seeking a buyer. He wasn't looking to sell the code to a rival tech firm. They would just turn him into the FBI. He was looking for mercenaries, data brokers who operated in the shadows, dealing in corporate espionage and state secrets. Finally, a user operating under the handle Silas responded. Silas claimed to represent a syndicate of foreign data miners who were extremely interested in acquiring the master key to EthelTech's client base. The negotiated price, $30 million, paid in untraceable cryptocurrency. It was enough to flee the country, establish a new identity in a non-extradition jurisdiction, and live like a king. Silas, The funds are in escrow. We require a physical meeting to verify the integrity of the executable file before the transfer is initiated. Bring the drive. Tristan, name the place. Silas, the Old Navy Shipyard in Brooklyn, Pier 4, tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. If we detect surveillance, the deal is dead. Tristan closed the laptop, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. His grand checkmate. He would take the 30 million, trigger the phantom code, and watch from a beach in the Maldives as Ethel Tech and Richard Hayes's newly acquired asset burned to the ground in the greatest cybersecurity breach in modern history. At 10:45 p.m., the Brooklyn Navy Yard was a desolate, imposing graveyard of rusted cranes and empty warehouses. The freezing wind whipped off the East River, carrying the smell of salt and decay. Tristan parked his rented sedan blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, clutching a titanium flash drive in his coat pocket. He approached Pier 4, the shadows stretching long and menacing under the flickering glow of a single halogen street lamp. An unmarked black SUV was parked at the edge of the pier, its engine idling silently. A figure stepped out of the vehicle. It was a tall man in a dark trench coat, his face obscured by the collar. "Silas?" Tristan called out, his voice trembling slightly in the freezing air. The man did not reply. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a high-powered flashlight, clicking it on and aiming the blinding beam directly into Tristan's face. Tristan threw his hands up, squinting against the glare. "Hey, cut the light! I have the drive! Show me the escrow wallet, confirmation." "There is no escrow wallet, Tristan." The voice didn't belong to a foreign data broker. It was female, crisp, educated, and dripping with absolute authority. The flashlight clicked off. As Tristan's vision adjusted to the gloom, a second figure stepped out from the shadows of the SUV. It was Caroline. She was dressed in a sleek, tailored black wool coat, her blonde hair pulled back severely. She looked entirely composed, completely unbothered by the freezing wind or the desolate surroundings. Standing beside her, holding the flashlight, was Jonathan. Tristan's stomach violently dropped. The blood roared in his ears. He took a stumbling step backward. "Caroline, what are you doing here?" "Taking out the trash," Caroline replied, her voice echoing coldly over the sound of the crashing waves. She walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete pier. "Did you really think you could outsmart us, Tristan? Did you honestly believe my father would seize a tech company without having its entire architecture audited down to the last semicolon?" Tristan panicked, his hand gripping the flash drive in his pocket. "You don't know what you're talking about. I have the phantom code. I have the master key. If you don't back off, I'll leak it to the press. I'll ruin Ethel." Caroline laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was a short, sharp bark of pure mockery. "The phantom code? Oh, Tristan, you really are a relic. When my father took over Ethel, the board didn't just fire you. They appointed a new interim CEO to restructure the company." "Me?" Tristan stared at her, utterly bewildered. You don't know the first thing about code." "I don't need to know how to code," Caroline smiled fiercely. "I know how to hire the best people in the world who do. I brought in a team of white-hat hackers from Tel Aviv the day after you were ousted. It took them exactly 48 hours to find your clumsy little back door. We patched the vulnerability, rewrote the core algorithm, and isolated your phantom code into a sandbox server. It doesn't connect to our clients anymore, Tristan. It connects to a dummy database filled with cat photos and fake financial ledgers." Tristan pulled the flash drive out, staring at it as if it had turned into a poisonous snake. His masterstroke, his brilliant revenge, was completely useless. "Then, who is Silas?" Tristan whispered, the reality of his total defeat finally crushing the last breath out of his lungs. "Silas is an alias used by Jonathan," Caroline explained smoothly, gesturing to the hulking security chief. "We knew you were arrogant enough to try and sell the back door. We just needed you to put it in writing, on a dark web forum, to a buyer you believed to be a foreign syndicate. You committed textbook corporate treason, Tristan. And we have the digital footprint, the chat logs, and your physical presence here tonight to prove it." Caroline stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away from the man who had promised to love her forever. She looked at his pale, terrified face, the cheap clothes, the unshaven jaw. There was no pity in her eyes. "I came here tonight to deliver a message," Caroline said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Arthur cut his first tooth today. He is happy, he is loved, and he will never know the coward who sired him. You thought you were a player in a game of chess, Tristan, but you were never even on the board. You were just the dirt beneath it." She turned around and began walking back to the SUV. "Caroline, please!" Tristan screamed, falling to his knees on the freezing concrete. The magnitude of his ruin had finally broken his mind. "I have nothing. You took everything. What more do you want from me?" Caroline paused at the door of the SUV. She looked back over her shoulder, the street lamp catching the icy gleam in her eyes. "I want you to enjoy federal prison," she said quietly. Jonathan stepped forward, producing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. In the distance, the wailing siren of a fleet of approaching FBI black and whites began to cut through the Brooklyn night. Richard Hayes had made the call 10 minutes ago. Tristan didn't fight as Jonathan clamped the cold steel around his wrists. He simply slumped forward onto the wet concrete, weeping as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the graveyard of his shattered empire. The federal courthouse in the Southern District of New York is a monolithic structure of pale stone and unforgiving geometry. For Tristan Montgomery, it was the final slaughterhouse. Because his assets had been entirely liquidated to cover his margin calls, Tristan could not afford high-powered defense attorneys. He was represented by an exhausted public defender who looked at the mountain of digital evidence provided by the FBI and essentially advised his client to pray. The prosecution's case was airtight, perfectly orchestrated by the Hayes family's legal apparatus. They presented chat logs from the dark web forums, verifying Tristan's intent to sell a proprietary backdoor, sworn affidavits from the Tel Aviv firm detailing the Phantom Code, and surveillance footage from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Tristan sat at the defense table in an off-the-rack suit, having lost 15 pounds. His golden boy charisma was gone, replaced by the hollow panic of a cornered animal. Richard Hayes attended only the opening statements and the verdict. He sat impeccably dressed in a navy Brioni suit, projecting absolute, detached authority. Caroline didn't attend at all. She was far too busy raising Arthur and running the company she had conquered. On the fourth day, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On all counts of attempted corporate espionage, wire fraud, and violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the foreperson announced, "We find the defendant guilty." The presiding judge did not hold back. "Mr. Montgomery, you leveraged a brilliant mind and immense resources for petty, destructive greed. You attempted to compromise the security of millions to satisfy a personal vendetta against your own family. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole." Tristan's knees buckled. He looked frantically at the gallery, seeking a flicker of pity from his former father-in-law. Richard simply adjusted his silk tie, stood up, and turned his back, walking out of the courtroom and marking the end of Tristan's existence in the civilized world. While Tristan was processed into a maximum security facility, Another casualty of his arrogance discovered the terrifying reach of the Hayes empire. Chloe Hastings had fled to Chicago, assuming her impressive PR resume would land her a lucrative executive position. She was wrong. Every time she reached the final interview rounds, offers mysteriously vanished. What Chloe didn't know was that Richard Hayes owned controlling stakes in 3 global media conglomerates. His influence bled into every major PR firm in the country. He had subtly, untraceably blacklisted her. 2 years later, Chloe was living in a dreary Cleveland suburb, working as a junior social media manager for a discount auto parts chain, forever haunted by the spectacular life she had thrown away. Back in Manhattan, the ashes of Tristan's betrayal had been swept away, replaced by a fortress of steel and renewed ambition. Caroline Hayes stepped into the gleaming lobby of the skyscraper that used to house Ethel Tech. The corporate registry had been wiped clean. In its place stood Aegis Core, a ruthlessly efficient cybersecurity titan. Sitting at the head of the boardroom table, Caroline was no longer the soft, expectant mother, but a formidable CEO. Under her father's intense mentorship, she had learned the brutal art of corporate warfare. She had streamlined the firm, purged anyone loyal to Tristan's regime, and secured massive government contracts. The Vanguard Group has signed the new merger agreement, Caroline announced to her board, her voice ringing with authority. Aegis Core maintains complete operational autonomy. We close on Friday. It was the exact deal Tristan had tried and failed to secure, executed flawlessly by the woman he had underestimated. After the meeting, Caroline took the private elevator down and headed to Central Park. Richard was waiting by the conservatory water, throwing breadcrumbs to the ducks. Next to him, laughing joyously as he chased a stray pigeon, was a toddler with bright, inquisitive eyes. It was Arthur. "Careful little lion," Richard chuckled, his boardroom venom replaced by deep, grandfatherly adoration. He lifted the boy easily into his arms. Caroline walked up, smiling a genuine, radiant expression. "Did the Vanguard deal close?" Richard asked, bouncing Arthur on his hip. "Signed and sealed," Caroline replied, linking her arm through her father's. "We retained 60% equity." Richard looked at his daughter, his chest swelling with quiet pride. She had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged as a queen in her own right, protecting both their legacy and her son. "Everything is secure," Richard murmured. Arthur babbled happily, reaching for his mother. Caroline held him tight, looking at the glittering skyline of Manhattan, a city her family helped build, a city she now helped protect. There were no ghosts left. There was only the future, and it belonged entirely to them. In the end, Tristan Montgomery learned the harshest lesson of the billionaire class. Money can buy comfort, but true power is an inherited, insurmountable fortress. He traded his family, his company, and his freedom for a fleeting illusion of supremacy. Today he is nothing more than a federal inmate number, pacing a concrete cell, entirely erased from the legacy he desperately tried to exploit. Caroline Hayes, on the other hand, transformed her greatest betrayal into her most spectacular victory. She did not just survive the fire. She used it to forge a new empire for her son. The story of the Montgomery downfall is a chilling reminder whispered in the boardrooms of Manhattan. Never mistake a quiet wife for a weak one, and never, under any circumstances, declare war on a man who owns the battlefield. Betrayal is common, but a Hayes family revenge is absolute.